Welcome to the Zachrilege Cast podcast YouTube video interview program that features me talking to some of the best and brightest in the atheist slash secular slash awesome community. This is episode number 66, not 666. We'll get there soon. We are recording live on August 9th, 2016. I would like to thank Dan Errol from danerrol.com, that's easy to remember, for being on the show last week. Help out his activism by purchasing his books, Parenting Without God, or The Secular Activist, or just get both of them, The Secular Activist, coming soon. So Dr. Karen Garst is the Faithless Feminist. Like many of us on the atheist spectrum, Karen used to not care about sharing her non-religious beliefs until the U.S. Supreme Court decided that a business has a sincerely held religious belief, and that's a good reason to deny its female employees birth control through the Affordable Care Act. How Christian, the Faithless Feminist was born. And in early October, you can get her book, Women Beyond Belief. Good evening, Karen.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me on.
And slightly early, we're doing West Coast time 2 weeks in a row, which is kind of cool. We're just up the road like 15 hours or so from San Diego, where Dan was last week. Are you near Portland? Is that right? Portland, Oregon?
I'm near Portland. I'm living right now in Salem. We're building a house in a small town called Silverton.
Okay. I was in Portland a few years ago, and pretty much every day was at a different brewery. And the wine's good. That's why I'm drinking wine. I just happen to have wine with me.
You can do a different brewery pretty much every day for a month.
Oregon has some good stuff. The Chutes was the one I remember. They had like an anniversary beer when I was there, but you can't go wrong pretty much anywhere. But we're not here to talk about beer. We're here to talk about to start your religious journey. So what was your upbringing like, and what kind of led you to this atheism thing?
Well, I was born in Bismarck, North Dakota. Do you want to guess how I was brought up? Make a guess.
I believe it was Lutheran.
That was Lutheran.
I read ahead.
Absolutely. Everyone I knew in Bismarck went to a church or a synagogue. I don't ever remember meeting a kid who didn't go to a church or a synagogue. I'll tell you a funny story. There was a Catholic school, and their team was called the Saints. And so, of course, what was their song when the Saints come marching in? I was in college, and somebody played that, and I said, "How did you know St. Mary's theme?" I didn't even know it was a regular song. I was brought up in a Lutheran church, went to Sunday school, went through confirmation. There were a few pieces of Martin Luther's work that didn't make it into that confirmation class, like On Jews and Their Lies. They neglected to share that one with us. But back in the day, I mean, that was my social life. We had this group called Luther League. We got together every Sunday. And did potlucks, went to bowling alleys. So I'm not sure I would have had a social life without the Lutheran Church. But it wasn't at all fundamentalist. There was support of science. I remember taking an evolution class in 9th grade, and nobody said boo, nobody walked out of the class. I rationalized that by saying, I wonder when God breathed the soul into man. Was it Cro-Magnon or maybe Neanderthal? So then I went to a 4-year Lutheran college, Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. And what was surprising about that experience, my first class, Religion 101, talked about the different oral strains of the Old Testament that they've determined through literary analysis. And I had never heard of that before, and it was fascinating. And the teacher talked about the exile in Babylon like it was a real historical event, which of course it was. So it brought a huge depth to things. In my junior year, I had a course on Catholicism, and the teacher said, "Now, my name is Father Emmerich Lawrence, OSB. Don't get the order of those letters confused throughout the semester." So I still have a notebook I kept. We were supposed to read this Catholic newspaper every week, and then we wrote comments, and then he wrote comments back. I still have that. And it's interesting to look back and see what my thoughts were. I probably wandered away. I didn't go to church much after I left college. I went to grad school, and not very many people I know went to church. And to me, church was always a family affair. So it felt odd to go into a church where I didn't know anyone. And then I got married. I will say I did baptize. We did baptize our son. And then we pretty much just drifted away. For me, it was reading the books of the Jesus Seminar. And I can even spotlight the book that changed my mind. And I became an atheist after reading that.
So what was can you go into more detail about what the Jesus Seminar was in the book?
Yeah, the Jesus Seminar was a group of scholars in the mid-90s. I think they were on the cover of Time magazine. And Dominic Crowson, Marcus Borg, who's actually from Oregon, and many others got together, and one of their tasks was to decide what Jesus really could have said in the Bible. And they used this color scheme. And if it was a possibility, it was one color, and if it wasn't, it was another. Then they published the New Testament this way. But what changed my mind was Bishop John Shelby Spong wrote a book, Resurrection, Myth or Reality. Because I remember that was, if there wasn't a resurrection, then it's done. And I read his book, and he hypothesized that, Jesus was killed and died if he was a real person. Sorry, Richard Carrier, but we don't know for sure. And that they went back to Galilee, his disciples, and that they said, look, he's dead, but there's still good news. And they came and preached the gospel. And for me, once I decided there wasn't a real resurrection, I was done. So I've been an atheist for a couple decades.
That's one way to go about it. I remember reading about the differences, like Lutherans and Catholics, and that being a big gap. Like, my parents were two different kinds of Catholics, like Eastern Orthodox and Western, and that almost kept them from getting married. And that was in the late 60s and 70s. So I don't think they consider themselves that different, although occasionally the Catholic thing comes up like it's this bad thing compared to Protestantism. It's like, hey, they came first, they got dibs, although technically the Jews have the dibs.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. When I was in first grade, like I said, I knew who everyone was, and this boy walked me home from school, and I knew he was Catholic. And I sat down that night at the kitchen table with my father, and I says, Dad, would it be okay to marry a Catholic? Now, obviously, there's something wrong about a 7-year-old talking about getting married. But, and he said, well, marriage is difficult. It's probably better if you're similar. And both my sister and I ended up marrying lapsed Catholics. So, and Catholic, there was Catholics and Lutherans were on separate poles in the 60s. So I can see about your parents.
Yeah, that's true. Although it seems like in a way, like the Catholics are an extreme version, but some of the people who are Catholics are just like, hey, whatever they tell us, okay, and they don't take it that seriously. But there's obviously a long group. So what was it like when you ended up working with a reporter from the Oregonian to expose the leaders of your church when you first got to Oregon?
Well, we decided, we were a part of this Lutheran church that was really conservative. There couldn't be a woman as pastor, and they couldn't be a woman on the council. And I said, well, forget this. And a friend said, well, come to the Living Enrichment Center. And we went there, and it was very, all paths to God, ecumenical. It's actually, technically, it was part of the New Thought Alliance. And they had just moved. They used to be in a movie theater, and they bought this old worker retraining center from the state, and it needed a lot of fixing up. And so they kept on going in debt, and they wouldn't really tell people how much debt they were in. And I'd gotten a call from a friend who was meeting with one of the associate pastors, and she said, you got to come over here. And I went over there, and they were like $6 million in debt and hadn't told anyone. So I had a meeting with the board. I had a meeting with the pastor, and I said, you're one of the best speakers I've ever heard. It was kind of like Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It wasn't really religion. And I told her, if you don't come clean to the congregation and tell them the debt, I will pursue it. And we had a meeting, and she didn't. So I went to the Oregonian. It was kind of my deep throat experience. I was met him at a restaurant, and I gave him a lot of information, and he wrote a very long article about it, and the church obviously collapsed. I remember calling the state because what they did was they accused them of violations of how you can ask for money. It's a securities issue and what you can and cannot do. And I remember calling the gentleman and he says, well, I can't talk to you. It's an open investigation. I said, no, you don't understand. I have information. Oh, okay. So I went down to Salem and met with him and gave him the information. I also met with one of the assistant attorney generals of the state. So, when I get upset about something, I usually pursue it.
Yeah, but even
and the pastor's husband, who was the CEO, went to prison. He was charged with securities fraud and went to prison.
I'm guessing that, I don't know, it's either that doesn't happen a lot with leaders of church because people don't investigate and the money's kind of, well, they don't have to keep as good records, but it must have been pretty bad.
Well, it was bad. She had taken over $200,000 from somebody who got a disability settlement. And, I'll put your name on my insurance policy in case something happens to me. And the woman was outed. When the newspaper came out and I used my name, I got a call from Florida from a woman who hadn't even met Mary Mannon Morrissey, who was the pastor. A friend of a friend said, you need to talk to her. Mary called her and she gave her $75,000 from a family trust. Sight unseen. So the woman was persuasive. Yeah. Wow.
That's that's pretty good. I wish I could be that persuasive. It's almost, there are times when I cynically say to some people in religion, I'm like, man, I wish I sold insurance. I could make some money, but it doesn't go that way. So what made you decide to kind of take things the next level, I guess, become more public and become like the Faithless Feminist and use that title and start your blog and, be more public about what you're seeing going on in the world with religion?
Well, I was having lunch with a friend of mine who's an author. And she said, oh, Karen, you should write a book. And it was literally the week after the U.S. Supreme Court had issued its decision in Burwell v. Hobby Lobby that you talked about earlier. And I said, the only thing I get passionate about is atheism. So I started out with my friends, asking them if they wanted to write an essay, and it kind of mushroomed from there. One of my friends introduced me to Peter Boghossian, who's a philosophy professor at Portland State. He wrote a manual for creating atheists, and he really introduced me to the atheist community and helped me meet people, secure additional authors, and I ended up with 22 women who shared their stories.
Yeah, your book is a bit like the show in which I'm kind of interviewing, and you're interviewing them, but you're kind of letting them tell their stories about women who have left their religion and mostly living without faith. So when did you decide that would be the focus of your book, to talk about women and their stories?
Well, I think it was after I met with Peter and I started to look at the books written by atheists, and I started to watch, all those debates on YouTube, and a lot of them were men. And I felt they really needed women's voices. So I decided to focus exclusively on women.
Yeah, it's definitely underserved and stories you need to hear, because it's definitely a unique, each story is a unique perspective, and I'm glad I got to talk to 22 different people. Now, one of the stories that really caught my attention was from Sylvia Benner, who called herself a gender egalitarian and not a feminist. What do you say to someone who thinks that Western women are totally cool and that we don't really need feminism anymore, and maybe even reject the term?
Well, I've had that conversation with Sylvia several times. And I would say, to me, we're still not there. If you look at different countries, Iceland leads us in wage equality. I think we're 65th, something like that. We don't have paid leave for newborns. There are a lot of things that countries that are less religious and more progressive have that we don't. Plus, I think that, she's coming from Europe. She's a very educated woman, very smart. And I think if you start talking to other people who are in different socioeconomic classes, who've had different opportunities, they would say, yes, there's a bias there. I mean, look what just happened with Fox News. Ailes leaves because of sexual harassment. So yeah, that's still happening.
Yeah, I mean, there are times when I want to listen to the stories of people who like to say egalitarianism. It's usually a white male who's using that term, but hey, in this case, it was a female, so I was glad to hear that. But it was interesting to hear her story because she was actually calling the heroine in the Twilight series. And no, I did not read the books. Actually, like a feminist character, and the bit about feminists being kind of like victims and having a victim mentality was like, I don't know about that, but I think obviously you can't say, hey, let's have 22 people talk and they all agree with you and have the same story as you, because that, people don't want to hear that. So I'm glad there were various opinions.
I think it was good to have her essay as a variety. Now, I can tell you though, entering this sphere and calling myself a feminist has been eye-opening, because I grew up, in the 60s and 70s. I checked. I've been a member of the National Organization of Women since 1981, and of Pro-Choice America, which used to be called NARAL, since 1987. So I've been around the block on those. But I usually post my blog on a lot of different atheist Facebook sites. And a friend of mine and I had done a post, we need more secular men. Not a topic I would ordinarily have chosen, but we collaborated on it. And I posted it on a Facebook page called No Gods, No Masters, Atheist Feminist, something like that. And they just totally mocked it. And I said, look, women wouldn't have gotten the vote if men hadn't supported it. We need to be together on this to move forward. And they said stuff like, oh, are you going to bake them cake? And I lasted about 20 minutes talking to them, and they kicked me off the group. So there definitely are extremes. All of this conversation on university campuses about safe spaces and trigger warnings, if you look at the extreme, yeah, there's some issues. But are we totally equal? No.
Yeah, I always feel like there's work to do, like how the Supreme Court, back to the Supreme Court recently voted on part of the Voting Rights Act, as if, and 50 years later, we're over that. And it always seems like these are battles that constantly need to be fought. If you see some of the political cartoons people had when women were trying to get the vote, you're going, yeah, they were not treated so well. And you kind of have to remind yourself that while we've traveled a long way, and hey, even atheists too, we're people too, kind of ignored by both major parties, but hey, we're still here. So you have to keep keeping your voice out there. So what was it like, once you reached out to the women who are writing, like the editing process, kind of going back and forth and kind of forming it together into what became the completed book?
It was a challenge. You've got 22 different women. Some were born in Europe. One was born in Africa. You got a lot of diversity. And these were not, some of them are very good writers, but they weren't professional authors. They didn't write for a living. I did hire an editor who worked with everybody on developmental edits, changed this, I think you should do that, left it up to the author, and then they redid all the essays, and I had to get those all back. And then the final draft, I had the editor do it again. And that was before I presented it to a publishing company. So it took a lot of time and it took a lot of work, but I think the product is much better because of it. And everyone to a person really liked the editor I was working with.
Well, that's good, because it could take one to just be like, you're changing my babies, as you're writing, like, you're killing my babies. How can you do that to me?
Exactly.
But how did it become that you ended up getting the book deal with Pitchstone?
I was primarily through Peter. Peter had published his book through there, and he's just been extremely helpful. I've got blurbs from Richard Dawkins, Valerie Tirico, Sakibu Hutchinson, and he certainly gave me the inroads to Richard. He is working with the Richard Dawkins Foundation on an app called Atheos. Have you heard about that?
Yeah, I have. I believe I've heard that it's out and people are saying good things.
And it's an app about how to talk to Christians without offending them and having them shut down. And I've got a piece in that. And so he's just been really helpful with inroads. And I had the opportunity when I was in North Carolina to meet Kurt Volgen, who's the publisher, and he's just been great to work with.
Cool. Yeah, Pitchstone's really doing pretty well of late. Last week I had Dan Arrow on, and he has a book coming out, which I believe is on the same day. So, no competition. Don't get into any kind of Twitter wars over it.
No, I already talked to him about it.
We're all on this. Yeah, exactly. I feel like that's how the community ends up. Ultimately, people are supporting each other. And actually, funny, I was going to ask a question about the blurbs, and you already topped that on there. I mean, it was quite a list when you initially sent me that. I was like, man, you got Richard Dawkins, you got a lot of names that I've heard. I mean, that's really helpful because it is such a crowded field out there with publishing, but you almost got hitting a niche that's, it's like, what, 51% of the population, yet it seems like a niche that isn't getting as much attention. So
and I did,
like
I went to the Willamette Writers Conference and pitched to agents. And I had a couple of people who were interested, but one was really funny. He said, well, I really can't do it, but I know my mom would love your book. So I'll have to be sure to send him a link to it.
Yeah. The agent hunt is a real thing for writers. It's a tough one. So I'm not a big fan of the term Judeo-Christian because I notice it's like a one-way street between Christians and using Judaism for their own ends, but it never goes the other way. But in this one case, in the appendix to your book, the subordination of women in the Judeo-Christian tradition, I'll allow the term. So why did you want to finish the book with this appendix and this story?
Well, I originally started with 2 appendixes, and I can tell you about the other one later. But what I did when I first decided to do this, I read a lot of books. I read a lot of books about early religion in Mesopotamia and Canaan and how did monotheism develop. And I read books by atheists. I read a lot. And one of the things I did was I took the Bible and I went through it cover to cover and listed every instance of a discussion about women. And so I did that, and I decided that, most people haven't read the Bible, certainly not cover to cover, and they really need to know how women are treated in it. And so I decided to use that as an appendix. The other one, I have a presentation I do from Goddess to God, Elimination of the Feminine Divine, and that really traces how did we go from figurines in the Paleolithic that were almost exclusively women to Mother Goddess, to goddesses and gods, to one male god. And that's another thing that I've done quite a bit of research on, which is fascinating.
Yeah, it is interesting how there's that erasure of, was it Yahweh's wife, or Yahweh had a reference to wife, and then it was like, do we really need a female god? The Romans had them, the Greeks had them, and maybe we should just one gender.
Well, what's interesting about that is when Nebuchadnezzar conquered what was then the nation of Israel, the southern kingdom, and brought them back, those people had to read the myths of that era. And so you have this story in Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian myth about Marduk. And Marduk's a male god. There's several male gods. And he tells his buds, hey, if I knock off the female, Tiamat, and it's just, will you support me? And then you'll make me top god. And so virtually the same thing happens where they have gods and goddesses and they eliminate them. So here you are, you're a scribe, you're a scholar, and you're sitting in Babylon going, how'd we lose? How'd we lose? How did we get conquered yet again? And you go, maybe we should kind of get rid of that goddess. That's what they did, and they beat us, so let's try that. And, you can't go back that far. You don't really know, but I think the fact that a lot of other mythologies were going through the same thing at about the same time of eliminating goddesses, it's not a coincidence that the Jewish people did too.
Yeah, that's the time in which these books or stories are written. Definitely a situation. There's a book by Bart Ehrman recently about Jesus. I think it's Jesus Before the Gospels, or it was a story about memory and how different versions of Jesus existed because of the different times, like after the collapse of the temple and all that. That's why he was a little meeker toward the end, because the Jewish people had been taken over, instead of let's fight them, because there was nothing to fight for anymore. But and just taking, it's like how authors take stories that happened before them. Those are how the mythologies from the past that no one remembers gets into these the stories of Judea and then Christianity, and kind of everybody thinks they invented them.
Well, and there is a process. It's called, syncretism. So in the early part of the Christianity, there were a lot of different sects. There were Gnostics, there were monicists, there were all of these different ones, and they kind of come together, and it takes 300 or 400 years, and then you've got the Catholic Church. And then what happens is, then there's a schism, and they break apart, and you've got the Protestant Reformation. So come together, break apart, come together, break apart is something that happens a lot in the process. So who knows what the original story was? Because the first gospel, Paul's letters were probably written around 55 CE, but Mark was probably written, certainly after the fall of Jerusalem in 70. So yes, perhaps 80 or 90 AD.
And it's not just how far after the supposed life of Jesus. It's the we're not quite sure what these books say. You go back and you're like, wait, they added this bit, or who even knows with Paul's letters? It seems like we know that some of them are forgeries, but they're all still in the Bible as far as I can tell. So I don't even think people know the history is quite crazy. But are you ready to kind of dive into this new era of publishing, and that you get to kind of do a lot of your own marketing and publicity?
Well, I've been doing a lot of that. I've reached out to most of the atheist podcasts, and people like you have said yes, and I really appreciate it. And then I have reached out to the atheist bloggers and offered to write a guest post about the book for their blog, with a unique quote from the book for them. And I've gotten several people who've taken me up on that. I have this presentation I'm going to do. I want to start out with secular student organizations and work with that. But I've done it to most of the atheist groups in Portland so far. It's a lot of work, but I have met just a great number of people, a lot of them on social media that I haven't met in person. I had the opportunity to go to the Reason Rally and got to touch base with some of the people I met. And it's a great group of people. Yes, the movement has its controversies and issues come up, but that's because we're human. But I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I've heard nothing but good things from the people who are actually at the Reason Rally. It's a long journey. Fun. So will there be like an official or unofficial book tour coming up? Or is the tour of podcasts and blogs to be that?
Well, I think given the subject matter, that's probably the first thing I'm going to do. I'm working with somebody for a Northern California tour, and I've got a lot of contacts. Our son just moved to Austin, Texas. So I attended the Atheist Experience TV show with Matt Dillahunty and Philip Sessions, and had dinner with them. And so I'm going to put something together there the next time I go to Texas. And I met somebody at the Reason Rally who wants me to do North Carolina. So over the next year, I hope to get out a lot and do that.
Yeah, North Carolina's pretty fertile. I feel like I've interviewed about 10 people from there, and that's probably the group behind promoting secular feminism, or Atheist Avengers, and the whole Reason Con, which is happening again next year in April. That's one I think I'll be attending again. So are you going to do like an audio version of this book?
An audiobook is already is in the works. The publisher's doing that. And there'll be Kindle available October 1 too.
Cool. So
and you can pre-order it now.
Was there a cliffhanger, and that means there's a sequel for the book?
The sequel. Well, the next book I'm planning is it's going to be a set of essays, mostly by women authors who've already done publishing. And it's going to be, I'm going to try to address every reason why women should leave religion. And I'm going to include ex-Muslims as well as the ones from the tradition of who are both, Jewish or Christian. So I'm putting that together right now. I've got several people who said yes, and that's going to be book 2.
We'll see. You already got the feature planned, and going with the ex-Muslim angle as well is a good one. So when it comes to talking to women who are religious, is there like an elevator pitch, or you think it's something that's going to take more time to kind of explain, like, not just like, why are you so, you can never say it to someone who's religious, hey, why are you so brainwashed? But is there a way you think to approach someone who is religious that maybe might listen to you?
Well, that's a very good question. When we go to Eugene to visit my husband's mother, who's 95, who is still the chair of the funeral committee for her local Catholic parish. She does the food at 95. They might be a little desperate. She always says, I wish you the best of luck, but don't talk about it. So there's somebody who's 95. She didn't want to hear anything about it. And I totally respect that. I have another friend who's a Christian who is a very strong Christian. And I wouldn't really broach a subject with her. I know she's not interested in talking about it. And this book is really for men and women who are on the fence. It's for people who've already had a thought, I'd like to leave religion. I don't know if I can do it. So they can read about other women who have done it and say, well, she did it, I can do it. We all look to models. 50 years ago, did I ever see a woman scientist? No. So did I think of going into science? No. I could have, but I would have had to been, the first person there, the first person in Bismarck who got a degree in science and was a woman. So that's why I wrote the book, because there's a variety of models, and you might not identify with everyone. You might say, oh, I can't relate to this person, I'm going to go on to the next essay. But there's got to be something in there if you are on the verge of thinking about leaving religion that would help give you a model to say it's okay and you can live a great moral life without religion. So that's the kind of audience that I'm targeting.
Yeah, that's a good point. You probably have better luck, and it'll do better with the on the fence, or maybe people who are sort of closeted but don't want to talk about it. The people on the other extreme end, at this point, all you can probably do is say, hey, I'm an atheist and I'm okay. And they may not agree with you, but at least they know you exist, right? And that's step one.
You want me to tell you a couple stories?
Sure.
Okay. Let me read you. This is a quote from Cale Wright. You must consider him a tool of Satan. My face refused to remain neutral as my ears took in this sentence. Did I hear him right? With an expression of incredulity and confusion, I looked back at the elder who had just spoken and the 2 others on the panel with him and replied, I don't see how that's possible. I don't think you understand. I love him. This isn't just a crush. I love him. I wouldn't be with just anybody. Jehovah is a God of love, and this is love. So I don't see how that is even remotely connected to Satan. Here is a woman who was raised as a Jehovah's Witness, in college ends up dating somebody who's not a Jehovah's Witness. And of course, one thing leads to another. She sleeps with him. And somebody rats her out to the church, and they call her before this tribunal of 3, of course, men who are going to disfellowship her, which means if she got disfellowshipped, if she got kicked out of that church, her family couldn't have anything to do with her again. So huge consequences. And eventually they decide not to disfellowship her, but she loses her religion in that moment. Now, good end to the story. she marries him and they're wonderful and they have 2 kids. But pretty severe consequences.
Yeah, some of the things that happen in the churches that you hear, you go, is this like a high school club or something? This shunning and these groups of people who tell you how you're supposed to act, and it's just like, but people really this can really affect people's lives, especially with families and especially with people who are not old enough to get out of the house, like where they're stuck in that situation. And the stories of women being trapped, I can't remember which author it was, but it's like she went through like 4 or 5 different versions of Christianity before getting out. It was like there was Mormonism for a while, and there's Jehovah's Witness, and just like each 2 years it'd be like, all right, new church.
Yeah,
totally
I think that was
different situations, which is just amazing. I mean, it's really great to be able to tell those stories. So you feel like, was there a story that, I don't know, was like one you're related to more than the rest, or one that like you totally didn't relate to, and maybe that's why it stood out to you of the 22?
Well, I think one of the best ones is written by Anne Wilcox. And she was raised in a fundamentalist church, which is more common than you would think. But the psychological impact, I mean, she basically talks about, I was told I was sin, and the shame and the guilt. And so what happens is you question everything. Oh, I wanted to have that popcorn. I wanted to have that ice cream bar. Oh, maybe I shouldn't. Or I wanted to watch a movie instead of this. Oh, I shouldn't. And it absolutely takes over your entire psyche, if you will. And she recently wrote me, she was at the beach, and she said, I went out and I felt serene for one of the first times in my life. And I think writing the essay really helped. Thank you. And, that just made the whole project worthwhile. That by processing this, by writing it, by telling her story, by getting it out, it helped her too. Not just somebody who would read it, but it helped the writer. And so that's one of the ones that's most moving for me, I think.
Maybe in a way it's got to be tough to say, hey, can you write about one of the hardest things you went through in your life, but at the same time it's a good story and it's helpful for the person reading it, and it's definitely going to be helpful for the writer, and just ultimately good's going to come out of bad. But initially I'm sure you'd be like, well, do you really, I don't know, do we need to go through this again? But I'm assuming most of the writers were very excited and open to get these stories out, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, of course, some of the people I asked said, I'm an atheist, don't want to write about it. I wasn't raised in religion, I don't really care, or I don't want to spend the time on it. So I ask a lot of people, and then I reached out through social media to get people to create a little more diversity in the book. And I had several people come forward and say, I really want to do this.
And obviously you want people the best stories and the ones who are most enthusiastic. So yeah, you had a lot of people to choose from, so that's good. So you mentioned earlier you're doing a talk on how female deities were being removed, and you're kind of giving this away as an ebook for people to sign up to a newsletter. So why did you decide to make this kind of a marketing thing for your site, and why is it that people don't really know about this story that you talked about earlier about female goddesses, about how important they were in early religions and how they were kind of sort of erased from what became the Abrahamic faiths?
Well, the way I got to Faithless Feminist is I realized I needed some help in marketing. And so I did some research, and I hired a great guy. His name's Dennis Lewis from Florida, and he worked with me. Now, the first name he proposed for the blog was Godless Grandmother. And I said, I just don't think I want to emphasize I'm a grandmother. Can we not do that? And he came up with Faithless Feminist, and I really liked it. And today, if you write a book, you can't just write a book. You have to have a blog. You have to have, a Facebook page. And so I learned all about that. And the blog it's a lot of work. but it's really fun because what I do is I try to use all those books I read and took notes on, and I try to bring them forth, whether it's, hey, there's a story in Gilgamesh about the flood too. Let's look at it pretty parallel to issues like abortion. The Catholic Church allowed abortions in the 19th century up to quickening, which was when you could feel the baby inside, no problem. So letting people be aware that it always wasn't this way. Now, back to the mythology. In high school, we had Edith Hamilton's book on mythology. But of course, none of the religions that people belong to were included in that, were talked about in that book. I mean, nobody put up their hand in English class and said, oh, well, is Christianity a mythology too? It was a clear distinction between everybody but. So when I started reading more about it, again, historically, how this change to a male deity occurred in several societies at the same time. And I think part of that traces back to this whole issue of property. You know, in the Paleolithic area, hunter-gatherers, even today, the hunter-gatherer tribes are pretty egalitarian. But once you start doing agriculture and herding animals, you become more sedentary. And where you plant your crop then is your land. It's not his land, it's my land. And you have to defend it. And so you start having groups who defend the city. Then you have fortifications and you have a ruling class. You get this class differentiation. And, you know, up until, you know, the United States, really, there wasn't any separation of church and state. I mean, you look back, the Pharaoh was God, or the kings were divine. They were, all the Greek gods were just, you know, the kings were descended from God. So I just think it's real interesting how, if you trace over time, why did we get to the point where there was only a male deity? And it's a lot about power and control. And it's still with us today.
Yeah, although it's odd that a lot of people who will say Christian God almost is sexless in a way, but it's like vaguely male. Like Jesus is like, well, he was a virgin. I'm like, okay, he was a virgin living up to 33 years old. Okay, people didn't think that was odd. No, it was totally cool. But it's de-emphasized, but definitely the male part tends to rule.
Well, if you look at the Old Testament, there's, even in the stories themselves, there's a transformation and a taking away of women's power. So what is the one thing that women do that men can't? They have babies, right? What happens in the story of Sarah? Sarah can't have a baby. She can't get pregnant. God has to intervene. Rebecca can't have a child. God has to intervene. So he's taking away what is truly the, you know, female ability. And if you look back at the story of Isaac and Abraham, and God tells him to sacrifice Isaac, and they go up to the mountain, and he's ready to kill Isaac. And there are some versions that I've heard about where he actually does kill him. But where is Sarah? Where's the mother? She's nowhere to be seen. She's not consulted. It's all men. And women, you know, there's a book called The Red Tent that talks about the practice that women had to go in a tent while they had their period. And when I was reading it, our son was small, and I told my husband, I said, yeah, there's this thing about the red tent women have to go to when they had their period. He says, oh, that sounds great. I said, they didn't take the kids with them. I said, oh, never mind. So you have this whole process where women are judged to be unclean because of what's a totally natural process, menstruation. They're judged to be unclean, therefore they can't go in the temple, they can't be priests, and you have that tradition continue in the Catholic Church. Now, in the early Christian church, there were women involved, but, you know, give it 300 years and they were gone.
Yeah, it did seem like the women involved in the early church were kind of erased or de-emphasized. And even the non-Catholic churches don't really think that much of Mary. The Catholic Church is, well, I feel like the Catholic Church has kind of kept the tradition of the multiple gods because of all their saints, you know, and Mary's become a god just because she had Jesus, although I feel like it was one of the stories, maybe one of your stories that I read, that in one of the early Gospels, Mary had like 6 kids before Jesus, which makes the whole virgin birth thing a little troubling, but maybe she could time travel. I don't know.
Well, and there's a commandment about no images, make no graven images. And the Catholic Church actually had to change that because, number one, you go into the Dark Ages and people were illiterate and people wanted those images. And one of the reasons they brought back or emphasized the Virgin Mary, and this occurred over time. I mean, first she was this, then she was exalted to that, then she was born herself of a virgin. It keeps getting expanded. And that may be, in a way, trying to coddle isn't right, but try to provide some kind of female image to people who believed in the goddess. I mean, we don't really know, but certainly the role that Mary's played in the church has changed over time.
Now, you've been retired for a while. Are you giving retirement a bad name by all this work you're doing? I mean, I thought retirement, you're like, kick it up, take it easy, maybe have a hobby or two, but you seem to have like at least a full-time, multiple full-time jobs going on.
There's that. I don't have to get up and be at the office at 8 o'clock, so that's good. The first 5 years of my retirement, I did my genealogy. And boy, I'll tell you, you got to be retired to do that because it's a black hole. And trace my ancestry back to 1635. I found out that I had a patriot in my background, joined the Daughters of the American Revolution, became a regent. So, yeah, I need to stay busy.
Yeah, I never think of in terms of like retirement and doing nothing. It's like, well, what do I do when I don't have to make money or I can devote my time? And it's definitely a good cause. So what are some of the stories you've been kind of writing about lately on your site?
On the blog?
What's been catching your eye?
Well, one of the ones that does really good is talking about sex. I think a lot of people recognize the hang-ups religion has for sex. And, being told all this, I was back at the Reason Rally, and one of the things the Secular Coalition did was lobby for medically accurate sex education. Our federal dollars right now fund abstinence-only sex education. It's a joke. It's pushed by religious people. And it doesn't work. There are probably just as many kids who are told don't have sex before you're married, have sex, as those who are told it's okay to have sex before marriage. But they don't have any of the information about STDs, about HIV, about birth control, or anything like that. So it seems that when I do a post about that, I get a lot of hits from it. Now, I think people of a certain age who were raised in religion, who were taught don't have sex before marriage and did feel guilty about it. I mean, that's just a natural thing. If you're raised one way and people tell you don't do, and you do it, you kind of feel bad about it. So there's still hang-ups about that. I also did a recent blog on church finances and about the mega churches that are being built, and some in the poor communities of LA, where people contribute $10 and $20 that they can't afford to give to build a mega church or a mansion for the pastor. I just think that's incredible. I know we ended up with some beautiful churches, but I'd really like to see them as bookstores.
Yeah, I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and Creflo Dollar down here is one of those mega churches. And I'm pretty sure he got the $65 million he asked for a new jet because the jet he had just wasn't good enough to, pass the word of God. And that's just, I think it's Jeremiah Kamara, a local filmmaker who did a movie about the black church. And like, if African Americans are so religious, why are their communities not any better because of it? Because they're more devout. So what?
I had a chance to meet him at the Freedom from Religion Foundation conference, and he's done a great job. It's a great film.
I know. I need to, since he lives in Atlanta, I got to hook up at some point, get him on the interview list. Yeah, the subject of guilt definitely catches on, because when it comes to religion, it's not just guilt about sex. It's like just guilt about being a human being, like who you are. You're born as I think one of those lines, like a zygote is guilty of sin. As soon as you're conceived, you're guilty and you're bad. And I'm thinking, this is a good way to control people, and it's kind of crazy because weren't we created after God's ladies, image? But yeah, that's just me talking. I don't know. Is there any new articles coming out?
Well, actually, the blog post I'm going to put up this weekend is going to have excerpts from the book. So I'm trying to get people excited about the book. I'm going to do some quotes, tell a few stories, and I'll probably do that for a couple of weeks, and then people have to buy the book to read the rest of it.
You really have to prepare. You think like, oh, I've written this book, and oh, I'm gonna get an agent and a publisher, and it's gonna come out in like a week or something. It's like, if you're lucky, you have a year, and you need that time because you got to get the excitement going. Like you said, you get to tell people about the book, but not tell them the entire outline, and say, get excited about this, and it's coming out, and this is something that you need to read. And with everything that you can read, and sure, there's a lot of free stuff out there, but don't you want to support people who are putting out stuff like this? Don't you want to make sure that more books like this come out? Because these are important topics, and this is just a movement in general that needs more attention. I would say.
It's about a 2-year effort. It's been about 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, you probably think at a certain point you get the idea, and then just to write it. And in your case, you had to get all those different authors and wrangle them and make the changes and get the deal and finally set the date. I mean, when did you know when it was coming out?
In the spring, I think. I think he told me in May or June the date, but I started working with him a year ago. So even from getting a publisher, it takes a year, because books comes out twice a year, and then they go to distributors, and the distributors, go to bookshops and market the book. So it takes a long time.
Yeah, it does. And to even get something to come out in paper is a big deal, because a lot of people just do ebooks now.
Exactly. Well, the Kindle version will be available October 1 too.
Wherever fine books are sold, right?
Or on Amazon.
Or on Amazon. Well, as we're getting about to the hour point, so if there's anything else you wanted to cover or talk about, let me know before we call it a night.
Well, I would just say that I accept guest posts to my blog, and there's some guidelines on the website. And if anyone wants to submit something, they've had an experience, or they want to write about a topic, just let me know. I'm happy to entertain that idea.
Faithless Feminist. But would they go to your site for that, or just find you on Twitter, or where can good people find you online?
Well, probably the easiest thing is www.faithlessfeminist.com. There's a reference to my book there, and all my Twitter, emails, etc. are on there. So that's just Google Faithless Feminist, and you'll find me. Okay.
And it's Karen_Garst on Twitter. My main Twitter account is _. So go _ people. So everybody, find the book when it comes out and get a copy. And I will include, of course, all the links to the book and the blog posts and everything in the show notes when we're done. So thank you, Karen, for being on the show tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really had a good time. I'm glad.
So if anybody wants to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/Zachrilege, ZACHRILEGE. And you can follow me on Twitter @Zachrilege, like the Zachrilege Cast page on Facebook. Send all hate mail to zachrilege.cast@gmail.com. Thanks to Karen for being on tonight. For all the listeners, stay safe. And if you need the chat, I'm available. If you're an atheist and feel alone, you are not alone. Reach out. Let's chat and get that human connectedness that keeps people coming back every Sunday to church. Stay skeptical. Good night, everybody. I love all y'all.